All right, this is the demo for my Zelda game. The splash screen is just kind of show that there would be another screen going there, but right now that's just an image. I did do transitions. That's a transition. I'll kind of explain how I did that. Um, I do have the player walking around, all animations. I have collision against the layers. I have the debug lines drawn right now. So if I go into the cave, I have the word showing. I have the NPC character where he's talking. I can't do any type of attack right now. If I grab the sword, now I can do attacks, and I have the animations for his sword attacks. I did implement an array list in one of my other ones that's a single instance, so that the inventory list travels with the player. Okay. So let's jump into the code. Okay, so here is my main game, so I can set the sizes for everything. I do a lot of initializing, so I only have one instance of Game Screen Manager. Asset Manager, I never set it up all the way though. My sprite batch and fonts. Now I did create some fonts for like the Nintendo type fonts. I did find some. I'm still kind of playing around with them, getting the right sizing, but I have 3 different types of fonts generating from that for black and white in different sizes. The Zelda game opens up the game screen manager, and it sets the screen to that, which is this, where I set up a hash map for the different screens and different play states. So to make it ultimately easier for me to be able to set up other screens and have it transition easily. So then I have it set up where I can just call this pretty much from anywhere. So once I call that, I can just give it the play state and it will transfer to that next screen. So the first screen that I have set up is my main menu, so that's my splash screen. That's here. I did do a static import of the Scene 2D actions so that it was a little bit easier to put the different actions in. But I just did basically a screen image and then added the texture to the image and set the position, and then added it to the stage. And then I start a sequence. So the sequence is that it starts at 0, it fades in, I delay it for a little bit, I fade it out, and then I run a runnable, which is then loading my next play screen. So, I mean, all of my screens are basically set up the same way. All of them have, a update, show, create, and render. And that's where I'm actually doing the rendering for that screen. So then it goes into my play screen. Oops, my play screen's not open. So here's my play screen. Let me make that a little bit bigger. I did have a different way that I was drawing the sword. I changed that to make it a little bit more like the original Zelda game. I had him actually swinging the sword and was using a revolute joint, and then looking at it wasn't at all how that was actually drawn. So the play screen is actually created in the game screen manager. So all this stuff is pre-set up. My init overworld, that's all the way at the bottom. Right here, where I'm loading the maps, and eventually this would get transferred to an asset manager. And then I'm individually loading the walls and the doors for, which that would be like the cave, the doors from the individual layers of the map. Then we open up, we're playing to it. This is where I do that animation. It's actually just one PNG image that's about half the screen is just black, and I have both of them placed side by side, so it's a black screen. And then I'm actually just adding an action where I'm moving them out of the way and then setting them to clear over a certain duration. So that was to try to do the same transition as what you see in the Zelda game in code. And then my contact listener, that's actually how I'm checking to see if I'm hitting the door, and if I do have I'm tracking my position from each screen. I actually have 2 player instances, one in each screen, and tracking the position of what they last went to. So then I go to the hide method and will set them as inactive when I go to the other screen. But once I have a contact with the door, then I'm setting my position of the player back to where I want them to be. I change my player state, so which way they're facing, and then I am calling the next screen. For collecting the what do you call the sword, that I'll have to show in the cave screen, but if they press space right now, it will check to see if that item is actually in the inventory, and then if it's of the sword class. If it is, then I'm setting a Boolean from the sword class to set the Boolean for the player class to change the different states for the animations for when he does the attack, and then I'm calling the attack from the sword class. Then I'm updating the player. I'm updating the sword, because the sword is actually drawn from the sword class, not from the player class. I'm rendering the map. And then in my render, I do have a remove bodies method. So whenever there is, and let me just go to my contact listener, whenever there is contact of certain types that I want to actually destroy, I add them to my bodies, and then I can call that and use that to destroy once the world is not stepping. So here's my contact listener. As long as there is user data and they're not null, I'm checking to see if there's a collision between fixture A or fixture B, whether it's a player or the door. The order doesn't matter, but that I'm basically setting that there is a contact with the door. And then my end contact, I'm saying that it's false. And then I have a method for his contact door that you've seen before. So if there is a contact and it's true, then I can switch screens. If there isn't a contact, then it won't allow me to switch screens. And I have the same thing with the sword. If there's a contact with the sword, then I add that to the bodies to remove. So that is generated in the cave screen down here in my init cave. So I'm loading the map, the different collision layers, and then the sword right here is getting drawn. And once that has a collision with the player, then it is going to get deleted from the world. And then I'm also adding it to my player's inventory list. This is also where I'm setting up for the wizard. And then my sword item, that's what that B sword is. It's being tied to it. So that's the drawing of that. So when I am collecting it on my update, this is it right here. So that's the callback from my contact listener. If he has a source, that's a Boolean value. And then I'm adding it to my Zelda game inventory. So that's my single instance of the inventory. And then I say that, I attain the sword as true, so I don't end up continually trying to draw it in my render method. And then here, I can do whatever I want with it. So the same with when I push space, I'm checking to see if it's actually in the inventory. If it's in the inventory, then I can actually use this sword. Here is where I'm doing the dialogue, and I'll show that one because I thought that was pretty cool. It took me a while to set that up. So again, I'm updating everything, including the NPC character. I had to actually draw a bunch of frames for him, and I'll show that. So if I'm using the sword, then I'm drawing the sword from the sword class. Otherwise, it's not going to be drawing the sword. If I've already attained the sword, then I am taking that off of being drawn, so it's not going to still be there, even though that body that it was tied to is destroyed. Okay, so my dialogue one is here. This is my dialogue class. So basically, I'm starting with a string completeness of 0, and I'm adding the text speed that we put in. I think I have it set to 10 right now, and then I'm multiplying by delta. So that will give me how many characters I'm going to use per frame, and as long as it is, less than or equal to the length, then it's fine. Otherwise, I'm assigning it that, and then I'm returning a substring of my dialogue that I put in, going up to that frame. So in here, this is where I'm calling it. So I'm giving it the delta, I'm giving the dialogue that I want to use, and I'm giving the text speed, and that's how it prints out on that. All of my screens, I have them extending the abstract screen so that I can make sure that I'm building them all the same way. So they're all basically have an update, a render, a resize, a dispose method. Those are all mandatory for me to be able to use the abstract screen. And for my players, the sword, the items, those I'm using an entity to make sure that I'm putting an update and render in all of them. So for my player, I'm doing two things. I'm having the animation, so I'm extending a sprite class that's implementing my entity. So I have to do the texture regions and the animations, and I built those from, this is my wizard animation. So I drew them out, and then, where's my zinc link? This is my link one. To do the alpha channel, so I'm identifying all of those in the code and then drawing it out. So down here, this is where I implement my animation setup. So I'm going through an array that I call frames, and each one I'm iterating through for which frames I wanted to add to the different animations. So that's how I'm kind of stepping through each different drawing piece for all of the animations. So for moving horizontal, up, down, and then for attacking up, down, and horizontal. And then when I'm going through for movements, which is the update method, all I'm doing is when I'm pushing certain keys, so this is where, if he has a sword, that's what's going to switch true and false, but he has to have it in the inventory to be able to use it. When I'm pushing A, I'm decrementing down by 2 and X. D, I'm incrementing, and then I'm changing my states. W, incrementing up. S, incrementing down. And then here is where I'm kind of setting my linear velocity by that X value. And then my speed that I established is just 100 F. So eventually I will end up adding health and different things in there. And then as long as, so then I call this set region, which will show that, but as long as they are, if the X is not moving, then I set the horizontal so that it won't continue to be looping. If they are moving, then it will ping pong back and forth between the two frames for the movement. The same for Y, if they're moving up or down, then they're ping-ponging. Otherwise, they're not reloading. Otherwise, it just keeps walking. So then my get frame is where I'm using a switch to check if the player's current state is north, south, east, or west, for which region needs to be drawn. And then if the player is using the sword, then I'm changing for which sword attack. The same thing for the horizontals for east and west. I'm checking to see if he's moving right. If he is moving right and the region is flipped, then I need to flip it back and make sure. So it's just so I don't have to do 4 animations. I don't really only have to do 3. And then the state timer is what's actually getting put in for those regions, and that's getting based off of the time that it took if the current state is the previous state. That's getting generated with delta, and then if it's not, then it's 0, so that I can track the movements. I did have this whole referencing angle thing, but that was with the revolute, so I took that off. Okay, my items, that's extending sprite, so it's making sure that I'm using that update and render. And then my sword class is also doing the extending the items. So I have it set up where I'm taking the player and the world and, the type of weapon. So technically this could be set up where I can have a bunch of different weapons set up, and not really a sword. I guess it could really be built for a weapon class, and then I can have the different weapons depending on the type that they put in. So then this gets updated for if, this is the Boolean for the sword that's ultimately getting passed to the player. So I only have one instance of the sword being created. I'm also doing the remove bodies here. So every time there is a collision for the sword, that's getting deleted so that he can redraw it and it doesn't just stay on the screen. Weapon attack. This is where we're doing the weapon attack. So it's checking the player's actual current state. So if he's north, then it's creating that collision box 2D body using my util, and then I'm setting the textures for it, and I'm doing that for all the different directions. And then, I'm removing the bodies. So let me show you quickly my utils. So this is my B2 bodybuilder. I did end up having to go down for GDX. I had to go down, libGDX, I had to go down to 1.9.6 because it wouldn't let me do chain shapes. And that was getting really tedious if I had to do everything in rectangles. But I can basically create a box on the fly and set it for what type of body I want it to be. And have that get set in the world as a collision layer. I can do that for ball. That's how I built my player. I do the same thing, and then I can add a collision ID. So that's the user ID. I can set that as player, wall, whatever, enemy, and then I can build that in my contact listener. This was originally me setting up for doing a chain shape, and then it wasn't working until I went down a level. Now here is the method that I call for building. Let me make that a little bit bigger. Method that I call for building the different map collision layers. So I just pass in the specific layer, I give it the ID, I identify it's a sensor or not, and then it's going through all of those map objects, and I'm checking if it's the class. So if it's a polyline map object, then I'm setting it up that way and calling this function, which is creating a chain shape based off of all the vertices of those points, and then setting up the body def and the fixture def for those items. I was trying to do it with creating a couple other objects so that I can kind of have it where whenever I want to create a map collision layer, doesn't matter what shapes that I have in my tiled maps, I can basically just build. I can just build, so like these would be polylines, and then there's polylines for being able to detect when I go into different areas. This is the only map that I have set up right now. But ultimately, if I'm adding collisions for trees and things like that, then the different shapes, and I need to be able to easily create them and make it a little bit more faster for me to build stuff. So I spent a lot of time just trying to build like utilities to make it easier instead of going through each piece after I had like a good framework of movements and stuff like that. So that's basically my demo that I'm also submitting for GDS for the game. I have all the pieces that I wanted. I don't have any music put in, but that was from the commercial, or from the YouTube video, that 14-second long thing. All right, thanks.